Princess Anne's unexpected confession shattered the world's carefully protected vision of her parents' marriage, pulling the veil off one of the monarchy's best-kept secrets. For decades, the union between Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip had been painted as the perfect royal love story: duty, devotion, and unwavering support in the face of relentless public scrutiny. But as Anne spoke, the cracks hidden behind palace walls were finally exposed. This wasn't the fantasy that the public had long believed. It was something far more complex and far more human. With striking honesty, Anne revealed that her father's decision to live apart from the Queen was not sudden, nor was it a result of bitterness. It was the inevitable consequence of a silent struggle that had been waged behind closed doors for years. The truth was as far more unsettling than anyone had dared imagine. Their marriage, while strong in duty, had never been free from friction. Beneath the flawless images of garden parties, grand tours, and state dinners, there were deep, unresolved differences that no title or crown could erase. Prince Philip, a man born into chaos and molded by hardship, found himself increasingly suffocated by the rigid confines of royal life. Elizabeth, steady and immovable, was married to the institution as much as she was to him. Their love was real, but so were their battles. Battles fought not with shouting matches or public scandal, but with the slow, grinding pressure of two very different souls, bound by expectation rather than choice. It would be easy to assume that the problems emerged later in life as age and distance grew between them, but Anne's revelations pointed to a far older wound. The first cracks didn't appear after decades of marriage. They had been there almost from the beginning, hidden under the weight of duty and silenced by the grandeur of the throne. These were the cracks no one dared speak about, the silent pain that festered behind the Queen's carefully measured smiles and Philip's often gruff, restless demeanor. Anne spoke not with anger, but with a daughter's weary understanding. She had watched it all unfold, seen the toll it had taken. She knew that her father's eventual retreat into a quieter, separate life was not a betrayal, but a survival. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim a part of himself that had been surrendered long ago. A quiet rebellion against the life that demanded everything and offered precious little in return. And so, as the royal facade remained untouched for public eyes inside the palace walls, the hidden rift grew wider with each passing year. But what really forced the man known for loyalty and duty to finally walk away? The story stretches back to his earliest days, and it begins not in the splendor of Buckingham Palace, but in the ruins of a broken childhood that would define him forever. Before he ever walked the polished halls of Buckingham Palace, before he ever stood beside the most powerful woman in the world, Prince Philip lived a life of chaos, heartbreak, and constant upheaval. He was born into royalty, a prince of Greece and Denmark, a child of two noble bloodlines, but destiny had no intention of treating him kindly. From the very beginning, Philip's life was a collision between grand titles and grim realities. The bright future promised by his lineage crumbled almost as soon as he could walk. Political unrest forced his family into exile, their crowns stripped, their names tarnished. By the time he was a toddler, he was already a refugee, carried away from the only home he had ever known, tucked into an orange crate aboard a British warship bound for an uncertain future. The collapse of his family was swift and brutal. His mother, Princess Alice, once a serene and noble figure, began to unravel under the crushing weight of mental illness. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, she was torn from her children and institutionalized, leaving young Philip bewildered and motherless. His father, Prince Andrew, unable or perhaps unwilling to face the devastation, fled to Monte Carlo, disappearing into a haze of casinos and loneliness. The result was catastrophic. Philip, barely more than a boy, found himself abandoned by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Home became a temporary word. Stability was a myth. Shuffled between boarding schools across Europe, Philip never had a chance to plant roots. Each new place brought unfamiliar faces, unfamiliar rules, and the chilling certainty that he was truly alone. In Germany, at Schloss Salem, he endured the rigid and often brutal discipline of a school overshadowed by the rising shadow of the Nazi regime. Even there, he found no sanctuary. When the school's founder, Kurt Hahn, fled the tightening grip of Hitler's Germany, Philip followed him to Scotland, enrolling at Gordontown School, a place that would harden him but never heal him. Gordontown was harsh by design. Cold showers, punishing physical challenges, relentless discipline. It was a world built to strip away weakness, and while it taught Philip resilience, it also deepened the emotional distance he carried inside him. Through it all, one thing became painfully clear. Philip would never again lean on anyone else for stability. Independence wasn't a choice, it was survival. He learned to rely on himself because he had no other option. Every institution he entered demanded obedience, and every experience reminded him that the world could pull the ground out from under him without warning. This fierce internal need to remain unshackled, to retain some sliver of freedom, even in the most rigid environments, would follow him for the rest of his life. It would shape the man he would become, a man who could support a queen, yet resist, becoming merely her shadow. And when young Philip crossed paths with a shy, sheltered Princess Elizabeth, the future of the monarchy would change forever. But for Philip, it would also set in motion a new and painful chapter in his fight for identity and freedom. The first time they met, it seemed almost like a passing moment in the grand theater of royalty, a teenage Philip, full of restless energy and sharp wit, catching the curious gaze of a young Princess Elizabeth. No one could have guessed then how deeply their destinies would entwine. He was brash, confident, a little rough around the edges. She was quiet, observant, and already aware of the crushing weight of the life she was born into. They were opposites in every way that mattered, and yet something invisible pulled them toward each other. A spark was lit, one that would smolder silently through the chaos of war and duty, growing stronger even when the world itself seemed to be tearing apart. As Europe descended into the fires of World War II, their connection, fragile at first, deepened through letters private, desperate notes that defied the distance, the danger, and the heavy expectations surrounding them. Elizabeth, barely more than a girl, clung to those letters like lifelines, pouring her heart into words that could never be spoken aloud. Philip, isolated in many ways, even among his fellow officers, found in her a steady light, a reminder that somewhere beyond the battlefield, someone saw him not as a soldier or a displaced prince, but simply as Philip. Their love grew not through grand declarations, but through the patient, quiet persistence of two souls refusing to let go. But outside their intimate world, storm clouds were gathering. Advisors muttered behind closed doors. Courtiers wrung their hands. To them, Philip was a problem, a foreign-born naval officer with no fortune, no stable roots, and a family history that cast long, troubling shadows. His sister's marriages, to German nobles, some with Nazi ties, made him a liability in the fragile, recovering Britain of the post-war years. Whispers filled the halls of Buckingham Palace. He wasn't royal enough, wasn't polished enough, wasn't the right fit for the future queen. Every glance, every conversation seemed to carry the same silent accusation. He was an outsider, and he always would be. If Philip felt the sting of this rejection, he bore it with the same silent fortitude that had carried him through years of abandonment and exile. But when the moment came, when he chose to formally propose to Elizabeth, he knew what was at stake. He understood that marrying her meant surrendering almost everything he had left of his own identity. To win her hand, he renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He abandoned his family name, Mountbatten, and in many ways, abandoned the very history that had shaped him. He traded the last remnants of his independence for a new title, the Duke of Edinburgh, a role crafted carefully to fit the needs of the British monarchy, not the needs of the man himself. The world cheered. Newspapers declared it a love story for the ages. The public, weary from years of war and loss, clung to the romance like a beacon of hope. But behind the pomp and the celebration, Prince Philip quietly absorbed a devastating truth. That the price of love, in his case, was measured not in gold or ceremony, but in pieces of himself he could never reclaim. Seeds of resentment, so small they were almost invisible, were planted deep within him that day, seeds that would lie dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions to break through the carefully manicured soil of royal life. The crown he fought for love would soon demand even more, and Philip's struggle to stay true to himself had just begun. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Philip and Elizabeth had carved out a life that was theirs alone. In Malta, far from the stiff traditions of Buckingham Palace, they lived like any other young couple, laughing without an audience, walking streets without escorts, tasting freedom without protocol. Philip, serving proudly in the Royal Navy, was finally building an identity separate from the shadow of royalty. And Elizabeth reveled in the simple joys of being a wife, not a queen. It was a fragile, precious existence. And it was destined to be ripped away. The death of King George VI shattered their sanctuary in an instant. One phone call, one moment, and Elizabeth was no longer simply his beloved wife. She was Queen of the United Kingdom, Empress of realms beyond counting. Philip's world changed just as violently. He hadn't married only Elizabeth. He had unknowingly married a 1,000-year-old institution, and it would demand every ounce of his loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice, without ever truly calling him its own. As Elizabeth stepped into her destiny, Philip found himself stepping into something far more complicated, a role that would define him, but never quite accept him. The first real battle came quickly and brutally. As the new queen's husband, Philip assumed certain things would change. Chief among them was the name of the royal house. Tradition dictated that a woman should take her husband's name, and Philip, fiercely protective of the slivers of independence he still clung to, expected no less. The House of Mountbatten would mark a new era, their era. But tradition and politics had other plans. Powerful voices behind the throne, advisors, courtiers, even Queen Mary whispered and maneuvered, and in the end, Elizabeth was pressured to declare that the royal house would remain the House of Windsor. In that single devastating moment, Philip's identity was erased not just privately, but for the entire world to see. He would father the heirs to the throne, but not one would bear his name. His victories, his sacrifices, his loyalty, they would all be buried under a name he had no part in shaping. Publicly, he smiled. Publicly, he served. But privately, the humiliation burned deep into his soul, a wound that would never fully heal. Friends would later recall the bitterness in his voice when he muttered, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba." Rare glimpses of his bottled-up frustration occasionally broke through the carefully maintained royal facade. A sharp comment here, an unguarded flash of temper there, small moments that hinted at the silent war raging within a man who had given up almost everything and found himself rewarded with invisibility. Yet, he stayed. He stood beside Elizabeth. Through the grand ceremonies, the endless waves of public duty, and the crushing expectations of monarchy, duty had become his prison, and there was no escape. But the public never saw what brewed behind palace gates, and soon, even darker rumors would threaten to tear the royal marriage apart, exposing the fractures no crown could conceal. Whispers began to swirl through the corridors of Buckingham Palace like a cold, creeping fog. They spoke of betrayal, of a secret hidden far from the polished smiles and royal ceremonies. The name on everyone's lips was Galina Ulanova, a luminous Russian ballerina whose grace had enchanted the world. And now, the unthinkable was being suggested that Prince Philip, the Queen's rock and companion, had strayed from the sacred vows that had bound them before the eyes of millions. At first, the rumors were little more than a murmur, the kind of baseless gossip that often clings to those in power. But the timing was dangerous, the stakes even higher. Britain's relationship with the Soviet Union stood on a knife's edge, and even the mere suggestion of a royal entanglement with a figure from behind the Iron Curtain sent chills through Downing Street and beyond. The media, sensing blood in the water, fanned the flames. Behind the polished headlines and careful reporting, there lurked a darker undercurrent. Could it be true? Had Prince Philip, the man trusted to stand beside the Queen through war, duty, and personal sacrifice, risked it all for a fleeting passion? No solid proof ever surfaced, no damning photograph or whispered confession. Yet the absence of evidence only seemed to deepen the public's fascination. And as the rumors grew louder, the impact inside the royal household became impossible to ignore. Behind the fortress-like walls of the palace, Queen Elizabeth faced a storm she could not control. Known for her stoicism, she remained silent in public. Every appearance measured, every expression carefully controlled. But silence is not the absence of feeling. It is, more often, the armor worn by the deeply wounded. Privately, those closest to her spoke of a different queen, a woman carrying the weight of heartbreak beneath layers of duty and protocol. Whether the affair was real or imagined no longer mattered. The very suggestion of betrayal had driven a wedge into the heart of their marriage, one that could not simply be erased with public appearances or staged family portraits. For Philip, too, the rumors left an invisible scar. Though he never publicly addressed the accusations, the shadow followed him everywhere, a stain that no title or ceremony could fully wash away. Theirs had always been a complicated bond, stitched together by love, loyalty, and compromise. But now, suspicion had been sewn into its seams, a constant reminder that trust, once shaken, is rarely fully restored. Even if the story of Galina Ulanova was nothing more than an invention of a restless press and a politically anxious era, the damage was real. The royal marriage, already stretched thin by sacrifice and expectation, found itself battered by forces beyond their control. Still, the Queen and Philip kept a brave front, standing shoulder to shoulder at events, smiling when the cameras flashed, but behind closed doors, the cracks deepened beyond repair, and a silent reckoning awaited them in the years to come. Long before the public ever caught a glimpse of change, a quiet transformation had already begun behind the walls of the monarchy. Prince Philip, the man who had stood faithfully at the Queen's side through decades of triumphs and trials, was drifting away not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but out of something far more complex: survival. The man who had surrendered his titles, his homeland, and so much of himself for the crown was slowly suffocating under the endless weight of royal formality. The palace, with its traditions, protocols, and unrelenting expectations, no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a gilded cage from which he could only retreat if he was to preserve what remained of his spirit. By 2017, Philip made the EE2 decision that surprised many, but shocked few who truly knew him. At the age of 96, he officially stepped back from royal duties, retreating to Wood Farm, a modest, quiet cottage nestled within the vast Sandringham estate. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic public statements, only a simple withdrawal into the shadows, a quiet fading from public life that carried far more meaning than words ever could. To the outside world, it seemed sudden, perhaps even suspicious. But those closest to the royal family knew the truth. This had been a long time coming, an arrangement forged not through confrontation, but through deep, enduring understanding. Princess Anne later spoke with rare candor, revealing what so many had failed to see. This separation was not the collapse of a marriage. It was the ultimate act of respect between two people who had spent a lifetime making compromises for each other. Elizabeth, bound forever to the throne, could not walk away from her duty, not even for the man she loved. And Philip, never one to be caged for long, needed something she could no longer give him: space, privacy, a life away from the heavy gaze of the world. Their needs had diverged, but their bond had not broken. They chose to live apart not because they had failed each other, but because they understood each other better than anyone else ever could. At Wood Farm, Philip found the peace he had craved for decades. There, he could live simply, away from endless ceremony, surrounded not by courtiers, but by the quiet countryside he had always loved. He spent his days reading, painting, walking, returning in many ways to the independent soul he had been before a crown changed the course of his life. Meanwhile, Elizabeth carried on in London, fulfilling the role she had never once abandoned, her every step still weighed down by the crown's heavy demands. Their physical distance became a testament to the strength of their connection, not its weakness. Love, real love, had always been about endurance, about choosing each other again and again, even when the circumstances became unbearable. And even as Philip lived his final years away from the glittering world he had once reluctantly embraced, the thread that connected him to Elizabeth never frayed. It only grew stronger, stretched across estates and responsibilities, beyond public appearances and royal obligations. But when a global crisis struck, An unexpected reunion would reveal the deeper truth about their unbreakable bond and show the world a side of their love that had been hidden for far too long. When the world came to a standstill in 2020, locked behind doors and fear, an unexpected miracle unfolded behind the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. For the first time in years, Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip found themselves truly alone. No royal duties, no endless ceremonies, no watchful public gaze. Just two souls, stripped of titles and expectations, returning to the essence of what they once were, husband and wife. It was a twist of fate no one had planned. But in the silent halls of Windsor, far from the pressures of the crown, they found each other again, and this time, the bond they shared was stronger, purer, and more profound than ever before. During those long months of isolation, the Queen and Philip settled into a life so simple, it almost defied their royal status. Shared meals at a modest table, long, quiet conversations without interruption, laughter over old memories, and a deep comfort in each other's presence that needed no words at all. For decades, duty had forced them into separate orbits, always together, but often apart. Now, the world's chaos had pushed them back into a small, protected universe, where their love could finally breathe again. And it wasn't the dazzling love of youth, or the fragile passion of early days. It was something harder won, tempered by years of compromise, sacrifice, and unspoken understanding. Those closest to them noticed the transformation almost immediately. Charles, burdened by his own complex destiny, spoke of seeing a softer side of his parents he had only glimpsed in rare, stolen moments of his childhood. Anne, ever practical, described it as a quiet healing and a long overdue mending of emotional wounds that had once seemed permanent. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. It was about the simple, steady rhythm of everyday life, the sound of two people choosing each other again, even after the world had taken so much from them. This final chapter of their love story was not born out of perfect circumstances. It grew out of resilience, out of forgiveness, out of a shared understanding that love isn't defined by flawless moments, but by enduring the storms together and still reaching out across the silence. At Windsor, they rediscovered what had once brought them together, not just duty, not just shared history, but an unbreakable trust, weathered and worn, but still intact. There was no need for ceremony now, no need for performance. In those final days, they were simply two people who had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of a nation and had never let go of each other's hands, even when the road grew impossibly steep. Yet, as their final chapter unfolded, Prince Philip's quiet wishes would leave one last stunning message for the world, a final testament to the love, loyalty, and dignity that had defined a life spent in the shadow of a crown, but never overshadowed by it. In the quiet spring of 2021, as the world slowly emerged from the darkness of a pandemic, the royal family was plunged into a grief that even crowns and centuries of tradition could not soften. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away at the age of 99, just 2 months shy of his 100th birthday. His departure was not sudden, it had been coming, a slow and steady fading of a man who had spent his life standing tall against history's fiercest storms. But even with time to prepare, the loss hit harder than anyone could have expected. For the Queen, it was the end of a partnership that had defined not just a reign, but an era. For the nation, it was the closing of a chapter they thought would never end. And for Princess Anne, it was the moment when her father's final wishes and the truth he had so carefully protected had to be honored. In their last conversation, a meeting marked by quiet dignity rather than heavy emotion, Prince Philip laid out a simple but profound request to his daughter. There would be no mourning, no endless lamenting over what was lost. He wanted gratitude, not grief. He asked that the world remember the life he had lived, not the death that came for him. He wanted the focus to be on the battles fought, the powerful sacrifices made, the love endured not on the frailty of his final moments. It was a reflection of the man he had always been, direct, proud, and determined to shape his legacy on his own terms, even in death. Princess Anne, ever her father's daughter in strength and spirit, became the keeper of that final message. It was she who broke the silence, who dared to speak the truth the public had so long misunderstood. His decision to live apart from the Queen in his later years had never been an abandonment, never a rejection of the woman he had stood beside for over 7 decades. It had been an act of loyalty, a mutual understanding between two people who had spent their lives navigating the impossible weight of expectation. It had been love in its purest, most unselfish form, the kind that respects, that liberates, that endures without the need for constant proximity. Their marriage had survived what most could not: world wars, personal scandals, public scrutiny, private betrayals, and the unrelenting gaze of history. It was never perfect, but it was rooted in a deep, abiding commitment that defied the glitter of royal pageantry. Through every storm, every whispered rumor, every moment of distance, they had chosen each other again and again. And now, in the echo of Philip's passing, that choice stood as the true monument to their union, far more lasting than any stone carved with titles or dates. Their story reminds us, real love isn't about staying together at all costs. It's about understanding when to stand close and when to let go. It's about honoring each other's battles, respecting each other's silences, and standing by through every storm, not because it's easy, but because it's right. In the end, Philip and Elizabeth's legacy is not just a story of monarchy. It is a testament to a love that bent but never broke, endured but never surrendered, and quietly, powerfully changed the meaning of loyalty forever. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.